perhaps being on the wrong side of the law. Well, whatever your relationship to it, this is a series which aims to demystify the law, help us to understand it, so we can perhaps use it to make our lives better. Welcome to UK Law.
Is justice now so expensive that it's only for the super rich? If you find a burglar in your house, what should you do? Arrest him?
And here in Stirling in Scotland, a town whose people once drove out the might of the English army, a vigilante force is now formed, pledged to drive out known paedophiles. Imagine that your pet, your dog, was taken away from you, locked in a filthy cage for months on end, where it finally died. Well, believe it or not, that is some people's experience of Britain's quarantine procedures. There's virtually no regulation covering pets' conditions in quarantine. Now, this week, a parliamentary bill is being introduced to try and improve matters. But our reporter Claire Kavanagh and a pet owner whose own dog died in quarantine are trying to find out why the present law gives pets so little protection.
You may think any pets suffering in this country are protected by the law, but you're wrong. Enforced quarantine regulations aimed at keeping the UK rabies-free means if you return from abroad with your cats and dogs, they're compulsorily incarcerated in secure cages for 6 months, but their welfare is not protected under the law. When Paul Williamson was serving in the British forces in Germany, he had with him his 2 dogs, Jess and Max. Now, after returning home, he has only 1.
The reason I chose the kennels was because it was a government-approved kennels, and I thought that, whilst they're in a government-approved kennels, they would be properly looked after.
What were the first indications that things were going wrong?
Well, the first indications which I saw myself were that the dogs were kept in cold confines, where the floor was nearly always wet. The actual sleeping area, the baskets which they had, they'd been chewed by previous dogs which had been kept there. So I thought from then on, I thought, something wrong here.
Jess's condition deteriorated so rapidly, Paul brought an undercover video camera into the quarantine kennel to film his dogs.
The first few months, basically, she was suffering from stress. She had lost a lot of weight, and the vets were called in and give her a check-up.
But under current legislation, Paul had no rights to insist on an independent vet assessing Jess's worsening condition.
I understand that she was treated by the vet, and then she was okay for a little while, and then the bleeding of the gums reappeared, and therefore she was diagnosed as anemia, taken into the veterinary clinic, and there she died.
What did you do about this situation?
Well, what I did about it was basically I contacted the RSPCA, who they informed me, they took it into consideration that the kennels are governed by MAF and government-approved kennels, and they weren't allowed in there.
Although backbench bills like the one that has highlighted this problem rarely succeed, the proposed legislation is popular and it may become law. If it does, its main aim will be to improve the welfare of animals in quarantine by offering the same sort of protection as that currently in force in other kennels. Paul's problem is not really with kennel owners, but with the present quarantine law, a law that offers no effective protection for the welfare of cats and dogs in quarantine.
We haven't really got any legal powers. We can't enforce any laws. It's strictly voluntary, and we would just hope that all of our members would abide by the rules that we have.
So somebody who isn't abiding by those rules can nonetheless continue in business as a quarantine owner?
Well, we have no law behind us to stop them. I mean, at the moment, even the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries hasn't got those powers.
Hello, Passport for Pets.
Animal welfare campaigner Lady Fretwell is the first port of call for many worried pet owners. She believes this week's proposed bill does not go far enough. What are you looking to achieve?
I'm looking to have a complete replacement of the quarantine system, the safely vaccinated pet, vaccine, blood test, microchip to prove it's the same animal. They should be allowed into the UK from rabies-free countries and from the approved countries. Sweden has done this. It's working. 3 years ago they started. They have no cases of rabies. They have a great drop in smuggling and a lot of happy Swedes. Why can't we do the same?
UK law invited the Ministry of Food and Fisheries to comment on the questions raised by animal welfare campaigners, but they declined, saying that the proposed legislation of animals in quarantine is under review.
Paul Williamson should have been able to bring in an independent vet. I think in this country, if we have any doubts, we can bring in an independent doctor, and if our dog were outside, we would bring in an independent vet if we were uncertain about things. He was not allowed that privilege, and he always has this uncertainty. He does not know what that dog died of.
Kennel owners, they've always had too much say in the rules on what actually happens within the kennels. I think those rules should be reverted to the pet owners actually having more say on what goes on within the kennels and how the kennels should be run and their pets cared for. And I believe if this was to happen, my Jess would have been alive today than so many other dogs that have been lost in quarantine.
If you don't like the way your dog or cat is being looked after in quarantine, you should first complain to the owner. Write to MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, or write to your MP. If you want to move your pet, it's difficult and it may cost you more. But it can be done if you can find another quarantine kennel with a vacancy and arrange for a special carrying agent to transport it.
Tomorrow, the House of Lords debates recent increases in court fees, the official cost of justice. But is that price already too high? Why does it all have to take so long and cost so much? In the first of a series of reports, Julie Hall has been finding out.
Richard Davis couldn't get legal aid when he set out to try and prove a multinational had broken his patent. He couldn't afford lawyers either. Richard had to represent himself. He lost the trial and the appeal. It's left him liable for an estimated £150,000 cost.
The trial went on for 4 days. And although I'm not normally a shy person, I said absolutely nothing for 2.5 days because I didn't know when to say anything. And the points that I thought they were getting wrong, I thought, well, maybe I'll get my chance later. After 2.5 days, I did actually stand up and say, "Excuse me, can I speak now?"
Richard was at a serious disadvantage. He was on his own preparing his case. The other side had a top-flight legal team and huge budget. Richard couldn't even afford the basics like a transcript of each day's trial.
The other side asked me whether I'd like to go 50-50 on the cost of an overnight transcript, which was a nice offer from them, but I couldn't afford even half the cost of having a stenographer in court every day. The result of that is that they had, every evening, a written copy of everything that had been said in evidence. So when they came to cross-examine the next day, they knew exactly what had been said. They had a copy, the judge had a copy. As a litigant in person, I didn't. So I was left just with whatever notes I could make with a biro on a pad during the day, which again is a little bit uneven. What is galling, of course, is that at the end of the case, being on the losing side, all those costs of the overnight transcript come back to me anyway, although I didn't have the advantage of the material day by day during the trial.
And not only those costs. When you lose a case, you're liable for all the expenses the other side has run up. The cost of their QC, barristers and team of solicitors. The cost of their expert witnesses, could be £1,000 a day. The cost of all their research and documentation. In Richard's case, a total of around £150,000.
I have been asked whether, had I known at the beginning what I was letting myself in for, whether I would have wanted to go ahead. But what really is the choice? You either say, I'm just a small person, I'm only an individual, I can't afford to be heard by a court. Or you say, no, I'll stand up and have my say. As it happens, it can ruin you. But I think as a matter of principle, everybody should have access to the courts.
Whilst Richard was nearly ruined by his court experience, Manchester solicitor Graham Woodward's been making his living from the law for 13 years. Like Richard, he believes levels of legal aid and court costs now put justice beyond most people's reach.
In Britain at the moment, unless you're in receipt of benefits or an extremely low income, there isn't that right to justice because, for instance, if you were a lorry driver married to a hairdresser, it's more than likely you wouldn't get legal aid at the present time. Therefore, you wouldn't have a right to justice.
The increases in fees imposed in order to make civil courts pay for themselves are making matters worse. In one go, the cost of a divorce petition rose from £80 to £150. The cost of applying for a trial in the county court doubled, and in the High Court trebled. And the cost of issuing a writ in the High Court more than quadrupled. Graham Woodward believes people like Richard will only get legal representation if solicitors are allowed to offer them a no-win, no-fee deal.
I've heard of hundreds of thousands of guys in your position, and the real change we need in law at the end of the day is to extend the scope of no-win, no-pay. If there was a position whereby a solicitor could take your case on no-win, no-pay, then obviously you get access to justice, wouldn't you?
What would it cost me?
Absolutely nothing.
But you've got to earn a living.
Well, at the end of the day, the cases that people would take, there'd have to be a more than average prospect of you succeeding.
But what happens if I don't need a full legal service? What happens if I can stand up in a court and say what I want to say?
Well, that's just, to be quite honest with you, that's just in the realms of fairyland. You won't get very far with that in real life.
But real life is seeing more people having to stand up for themselves in court because of cutbacks in legal aid. In 1950, 80% of people were eligible. Today, it's below 50%. But even if you succeed in getting to court, cases can take a long time, and time costs money. When Richard was here at the High Court, he couldn't believe the hours were just 10 to 4.
So here we are at the powerhouse of British justice, and it's 5:30 in the evening, and they're shut. Well, there's certainly millions of pounds invested here, which at the moment is just lying idle in the evening. And of course, ordinary people have got other jobs to do during the day.
If you had 2 shifts per day, that would double the speed your case comes on, and it would save a lot of costs, and it would save a lot of time. Well, it's a lot cooler in here.
Yeah.
Next stop to meet the head of civil justice. Is the policy of making the civil courts pay for themselves now putting justice out of most people's reach?
Well, I want to know about the increasing court fees. Do you think that the law itself should be a self-financing operation, or is it a public service?
No, of course it's a public service. The system for the administration of justice stands broadly on 3 main pillars.
Mm-hmm.
One is the police, a second is the criminal justice system, and the third is the civil justice system. And both are essential ingredients for any civilized country that conducts its affairs in accordance with the rule of law to provide for its citizens. And no one would suggest that the police or the criminal justice system should be required to be self-financing. And why the devil they should suggest that for the civil justice system beats me, and I object to it.
Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, do you agree that the scope of no-win, no-fee should be increased in this country?
I not only agree, I thoroughly support it. I recommended the previous Lord Chancellor there should be such an extension, but the item was left over till after the general election. It's on the table of the present Lord Chancellor. He hasn't yet had time to consider it, and I don't personally have much doubt, of course this must be left to him, but I don't have much doubt that he will authorise an extension.
Do you accept thousands of people in this country at the present time cannot get access to justice because they simply can't afford it?
Well, I certainly do. I would have put it higher than thousands. I would have said hundreds of thousands.
And do you agree that the increase in the scope of work solicitors could do on a no-win, no-fee basis would increase the access to justice?
It obviously would. And anything that would increase the access to justice in a sensible way, without doing violence to any other of the principles on which our system of justice is based, would have my wholehearted support.
Right. Vice-Chancellor, if I can take up one other topic we were discussing earlier, should we be looking to the future to more support for litigants in person, or would you rather see more funding available for proper, full legal representation?
The government is bound to want to impose limitations on legal aid. The legal aid bill has got absurd. About 4 or 5 years ago, I think it stood at 400 or 500 million a year. Last year it was at 1.5 billion. And that sort of demand-led increase in public expenditure can't be allowed to continue by any government. So there are going to be limitations, and we've got to look at alternatives. Conditional fee agreements is one. More assistance to litigants in person is another. A third possibility, which I would like to see encouraged by government and by all professional organisations in the field, is the use of litigation cost insurance. People insure against liability that their dogs may cause, or that a tree in their garden falling may cause. They can also insure, but they tend as yet not to do so very much, against the possibility that they may become embroiled in litigation. There's no reason why employers shouldn't offer policies of that sort as part of individuals' wage packages. There's no reason why government shouldn't give tax incentives to them to give those sorts of benefits in kind. These are all areas in respect of which some advance can be made in improving access to justice for individuals, and all need attention.
From what you've heard today, do you think you're going to get some of the changes you think are needed?
Well, I anticipate it's inevitable at the end of the day, else hundreds of thousands of people will be denied justice. And with the current government, that just won't be tolerated, in my view.
Well, I'm very encouraged. Firstly, the Vice-Chancellor was willing to talk to us. He accepts there's a problem, and he's positive about wanting some change. So we're not there yet, but I think we could see some improvements.
The only question at the end of the day is how long. Change is inevitable.
If you can't afford to go to court and are considering representing yourself, then the National Council for Access to the Law may be able to give you advice. You can write to them at 193 Chiltern Court, London NW1 5SD.
Okay, so you're walking down the street and you see something that looks to you like it might be a crime. What do you do? Well, the time-honored method is to call the police, but you haven't got a telephone and you think they're going to get away with it. So could you arrest them? It's a bit of a controversial one, this. The idea of citizens actually arresting each other. It doesn't seem right somehow. That's what the police are supposed to do. But it's true, you can arrest someone, it just pays to be careful. First of all, if the situation looks at all dangerous, don't attempt it. And beware, it's the citizen that could end up in trouble. So what is the legal situation? In essence, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act states that any person may arrest anyone who is in the act of committing or anyone you suspect is committing an arrestable offence, like burglary. Now, you're probably wondering what you say to somebody when you actually arrest them. Do you give them a formal warning with words like, anything you say will be taken down and given in evidence against you? Well, no, you don't. Just tell them what you're doing, like, I'm arresting you for breaking into that house, or whatever you think it was. Also, your good intentions could backfire, because often it's the have-a-go citizen who's the one who ends up getting prosecuted. So if you do arrest someone, what are the tips to help you from getting on the wrong side of the law? Call the police immediately, or you could find yourself charged with kidnapping. Only use reasonable force. The official line is that the citizen must only exert sufficient force to subdue the suspect and protect him or herself. Ensure it's an arrestable offence. Note burglary and theft are arrestable offences, and traffic offences and common assault are not. But above all, think about what you're doing. Clearly, some people could be dangerous, so don't take any chances.
Stirling in Scotland, where vigilantes recently tracked down and hounded out a convicted sex offender. Each week on UK Law, we'll be going to a town to examine the arguments surrounding a big legal issue. This evening, we asked the people here to discuss what we should do about paedophiles.
The introduction of a sex offenders register is designed to make our children safer. But who should be told who's on the register? And what would you do if you discovered that a convicted child abuser had moved in next door to you?
The government is presently consulting about who should be given information contained in the register, like the addresses of known paedophiles. Should it just be social workers, teachers and professionals, or should anyone living locally have the right to know? Mags Heaney led a campaign to drive a known paedophile off the estate where she lives. She and others stood shouting on his doorstep for 2.5 hours before she was successful and he was removed from his home. She's outspoken in her views of sex offenders.
I don't care how small the offence is, the minute they take the tendencies to a child, they're entitled to go to jail for it. That's not a manly act. That is a man who's trying to gain power because he's no man enough to stand up to a normal woman. And as far as I'm concerned, he's entitled to rot in the jail, no matter how small the offence is. He has violated a child's rights.
We brought together Mags and 3 other people who have experience of living or working with paedophiles to the Wallace Monument, just outside Stirling. And do you think the sex offender themselves, having served their time, as it were, do they have rights that we should respect too?
They do have rights, yes. The question of whether we're satisfied with the court's decisions or not is a different matter, and it may be that Mrs Haney would think that the sentences that are imposed by the courts are not appropriate or not sufficient. But once someone has served a sentence judged by the court to be appropriate, taking into account various reports and perhaps including an element of treatment or rehabilitation, then I'm afraid we should just have to put up with that.
Pauline, you had a paedophile living next door to you for a time. Do you think that that sex offender has rights?
As far as I'm concerned, any person who abuses a child really gives up their civil rights. What we're saying is, if they're going to be placed back in the communities, people should have the right to know that they're there. That's what we're saying. We're not saying to hound them out and put them onto someone else's doorstep, because then it just increases the problem.
I want to pick up on your point about notification, about the idea that you have a right to know that there's a paedophile living in your community. John, does she?
No, and it wouldn't make anyone's children any safer knowing that there was a sex offender in the area. A register of sex offenders is going to lead to innocent people being hounded out of the area. It's going to lead to sex offenders who are involved in treatment and rehabilitation being hounded out of the area, which is completely counterproductive. I'm not here to defend sex offending, but sex offenders, once they've been dealt with by the system, should have the chance of rehabilitation. I believe everyone should have the chance of rehabilitation, and we then just have to live with that. I don't think just sending, if we're going to send them to prison or say that they've no rights, we'd be as well just executing them.
Right. We're living in a safari park full of animals, and the animals are roaming the street and they're molesting your children, and if the government can't stop it, then the people have got to stand and be accounted for and say, enough's enough, it's our turn now. That's my opinion.
Can I say,
and the government's betraying us.
I think these opinions are fine, but what's not being said here is, what can we do to make a change? We're not going to lock people away from the rest of their lives, and obviously we're not, because the system will not allow that, and I think quite rightly so as well. I think we have to look at what happens with paedophiles when they come out into the community. What can we provide? What level of monitoring can we provide in the community that can be structured, that we have, where we are actually monitoring them, if necessary, I've got to say, for the rest of their life.
Is the government going to pour money in to put security on your streets, or is the parents going to have to provide their normal life, have to run after their children because they're abuse loose in the street? Because that's what you're talking about here.
What I'm saying is, I am agreeing with your first point that you made earlier on, that we need more resources to work with paedophiles, so that we can bring them out into the community and expect them to run about.
It's going to cost a fortune. You're telling me that we only know of a fraction of the paedophiles, the ones who get caught.
It's going to cost £25,000 a year to keep somebody in prison.
Yeah. £25,000 to keep them in prison. How much is it going to cost to have somebody watching them? Really?
Far less to supervise them effectively, yes. And effective supervision probably does mean, as Dorothy was suggesting earlier on, far more effective supervision than is possible at the moment because of the lack of resources that are available there, where once a fortnight or once a week supervision does turn into once a fortnight or once a month. That's not good enough, because it would be very easy to get round that sort of supervision.
Is it realistic to imagine that any register could remain confidential? Already there have been leaks, unofficial tip-offs, which have resulted in cases of mistaken identity.
Never mind picking on the wrong people. Innocent people do get victimised by vigilante groups, but picking on the right people even. There was a case in Edinburgh a few years back where a convicted sex offender who got probation for interfering with some young boy was killed. Someone was charged with murder, eventually convicted of culpable homicide, and was sentenced ultimately to 7 years in prison. And part of his case was that it was okay to kill a sex offender, and he had a petition signed by thousands of people in the area saying that that was okay. That's one of the problems we have to deal with in this area as well. So never mind hounding out the wrong people. Even if you're hounding the right people, the way you might end up doing it could end up with somebody dying, and I don't believe that anyone here would condone that.
What do you think? Should we know where convicted paedophiles are living, or should they be left alone in peace? The government is still consulting people, and the man responsible is Home Office Minister Alan Michael. If you want to write to him, the address is the Home Office, 50 Queen Anne's Gate, London, SW1H 9AT. For any details of the items covered in this week's programme, we've produced a free fact sheet. For a copy, please write to UK Law 1, P.O. Box 55, London, W12 8UE, or you can ring the Channel 5 order line on 0990 55 50 55. And if you think you have a problem with the law that we might be interested in for a future programme, call the UK Law Hotline on 0891 700 151.